Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy in the modern world, moving into the reign of Pope 235, Urban VIII, who reigned from 1623 to 1644. Because of the brevity of the reign of Pope Gregory XIII, the conclave of 1623 was not ready for a complete change in policy, so they elected another diplomat, one who shared Gregory's outlook on the world and the way that the church should interact with it. His baptismal name was Maffeo Barberini, Barberini, who served for 21 years as the 235th pope under the name Urban VIII, the last pope so far to take the name Urban. Born in Florence in 1568 into a ridiculously wealthy merchant family, Barberini took his early education under the Jesuits and completed it with a doctorate in law from Pisa in 1589. He entered papal diplomatic service, serving on a mission to France, was appointed to the College of Cardinals in 1606, became ordained Bishop of Spoleto in 1608, papal legate to Bologna, 1611, and prefect of the Apostolic Signatura in 1617. That's the Supreme Court of the Church. As Pope Urban VIII, he was a man of high refinement and sophistication. His vision of church service was that it was an exalted and noble calling, so he made efforts to ensure that those in all ranks of the church would receive the honor he believed they deserved. This was of particular importance because for over a century, the faithful had been bombarded by anti-clerical ecclesial writings of the Protestant, anti-Catholic publicity machine. One such recognition Pope Urban instituted remains in use to this day. He clarified the position of cardinals. Canonically, the only function of a cardinal is to elect the pope. But in practical terms, it had already developed, and had been the case for centuries, that the cardinals also had senior functions in the operation of the church. And the name, seminarians, you're Latin, remember you're Latin. The Latin word cardex is a hinge. So they were the hinge men. So in addition to their canonical role as papal electors, Urban used his authority as head of state, as essentially as the monarch of the papal state, to name all cardinals as princes, that they would be princes of the realm. In other words, that like of the papal state, princes of the papal state, meaning that they were in precedence, the rank and precedence, as the diplomatic usage, that they were outranked only by heads of state. He also replaced their existing form of address, which had been illustrious and most reverend. He changed that to eminence, your eminence, and that's still the usage. Cardinals are addressed as eminence. The Baroque period, meaning the Catholic Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, was a time of great devotion among the faithful. Since Protestants had expended so much energy ridiculing Catholic devotions and to vandalizing works of sacred art, and in some cases to murdering, the faithful, the laity, priests, nuns. Therefore, devotion to the saints became central to Baroque piety, to post-Council of Trent piety. Now, as often happens, something that started well-intentioned can go to extremes when fueled by emotions, such as the emotions triggered by 150 years of religious wars, which was still going on. Remember, the 30 Years' War is still going on when Urban was elected. With this in mind, and as a well-traveled man, before becoming Pope, Urban had, seen the way things were done in a wide range of context. So as Pope, he was concerned that the faithful were giving veneration to people who were not actually saints. So he made a series of adjustments, beginning on October 30th, 1625, with the goal of bringing order and clarity to the veneration of the saints, and the process through which an individual was proclaimed to be a saint. He began the reform with a decree that no individual could be represented in art with a halo, or be honored with an altar, candles, or artistic representation for the purpose of devotion, until that person had been through this process, the process he created. His reorganization of the canonization process remained the norm until the 18th century, when there was another upgrade. Prior to this, the veneration of saints fell into two categories. First, prescriptive. Second, permissive. Prescriptive veneration of the saints was that instituted by papal authority as a practice in the universal church. This would include special prayers in the breviary and a definitive ranking in the liturgical calendar. Permissive veneration, on the other hand, was a process which no longer exists today, but it did when Urban became Pope, whereby a bishop could decree that the local faithful within that diocese could venerate a particular person, either because they were martyrs or because they were known for a life of holiness. After Urban's reforms, canonization was defined as creating a devotion that was universal and obligatory. The Pope could use one of two methods, each consisting of a distinct type of canonization. First was formal canonization, which occurred when prescribed as a definitive decision after a canonical process. Second, equivalent canonization occurred when the Pope, on his own authority, for whatever reason seemed good to him, would omit the canonical process and simply order that a person be venerated in the universal church. The formula used in the act of canonization, and you remember, seminarians, the way we pray is the way we believe, so wording matters. Quote, in honor of, and then they would give the name, we decree and define, teaching words, that blessed, then the name, is a saint, and we inscribe his name in the catalogue of saints, in order that his or her memory be devoutly and piously celebrated yearly on the, and then they would give the day, on this day of this year, as his or her feast. End quote. Urban's ruling included a definitive process of canonization. It would be a formal investigation, again in two parts. The first part on the diocesan level, the second part in Rome. Each would research, record, and verify the life of the saint in terms of three categories: heroic virtue, doctrinal orthodoxy, and efficacious intercession. The process would proceed from diocesan level. Well, it had to complete. The diocesan level process had to be complete, and all the documents, codified, and the bishops say, okay, yes, we've taken it as far as we can. We fulfilled all these conditions, and we have the documents to verify it. Then sent to Rome, and then Rome would review it. And so there was a process for. So once that happened, and if Rome approved the initial level, then there would be veneration. The person was then declared worthy of so they'd be the venerable whoever. Then two miracles were needed, verified from people praying to this person as a venerable. And if those were approved, then the person would be a beatus, a beatified. Then, after beatification, another 2 miracles were required, verified from individuals praying to the person as a beatus. And then if those second 2 were approved, then canonization would occur. During the next reform process, anyway, okay, so we'll get to that. There was another big reform in the 18th century, then another reform in the 20th century with Pope John Paul II. For current teaching, summarized, see the Catechism, number 828 on canonization, and see numbers 946 through 953 on the Communion of Saints. And Pope John Paul II's reform, the most recent major reform of the process, dated January 25th, 1983, and the document was Divini Perfectionis Magister. Southeast of Rome, Pope Urban built a villa for the popes to use in the holidays, and it still belongs to the Holy See. I mean, he used his own money because his family was, as we said, ridiculously wealthy, and it still exists. This is the Castle Gandolfo, southeast of Rome. Urban's predecessor, Pope Gregory XV, had created the propagation of the faith, as we saw, to oversee the creation of new churches in the New World, and in lands where the church could not operate freely. Pope Urban VIII took this one step farther by creating a special international seminary designed to train men for the priesthood to serve in missionary lands or in lands of persecution. And sometimes that was the same. And the college was named in his honor, the Collegium Urbanum, or the Urban College. It opened in 1627. Prior to the creation of the North American College in Rome, the NAC, candidates for the priesthood in the United States who were sent to Rome for studies attended the Urban College, because the United States was, considered missionary territory until 1908. And even after the creation of the NAC, African-American men preparing for priesthood also studied at the Collegium Urbanicum, the Urban College. Okay, we previously covered, a few reigns ago, the first trial of Galileo. And I left a teaser there saying, we had not heard the last from him, and so now we meet him again. We last encountered him in the reign of Paul V, so now recall that he was commanded on March 5th, 1616, that he not teach the heliocentric, sun-centered theory of the universe as fact. He had agreed to this stipulation, and the case was considered closed by all involved. Well, time passed. In 1620, the Index of Forbidden Books went through one of its regular updates, and Copernicus, the works of Nicholas Copernicus, was taken off the list. Now, Copernicus was a Polish mathematician and priest, by the way. He was deceased by this point. But he prior to Galileo, he's one that had theorized that the earth was not the center of the universe, but that the sun was. But he had no instruments to be able to verify it. It was just a mathematical thing. Well, in the 1620 review of the index, his works were taken off the index. So Galileo believed that this freed him to once more publish about the sun-centered universe. In 1629, he published a work titled Dialogue on the Two World Systems. It was written in the form of a Platonic dialogue, which altogether ended up asserting, once again, the heliocentric universe as fact. He was condemned for disobedience and for breaking his vow, technically, which was perjury, because he gave that oath in the context of a church juridical process. that he not teach it as fact. And for this he was condemned for perjury on June 16th, 1633. And, then as now, perjury is a crime, and it's published with imprisonment. So he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. But because he was 70 years old, and his eyesight was failing, he was given to the custody of the Archbishop of Siena, who was a personal friend. So Galileo was allowed to serve his sentence in a villa outside of Florence, where he continued to write, but not publish, until he went blind from staring at the sun too long through his telescope. And he lived in blindness for the final 5 years of his life, dying on January 8th, 1642. So that's the second trial of Galileo. No one emerged well from the Galileo affair. Pope John Paul II apologized. Those of a certain age may remember when this happened. He apologized on October 31st, 1992, for the way the Galileo affair was handled. Because, and John Paul conceded this, the Church has never been promised infallibility in teaching on matters of astronomy. Now, on the other side, Galileo's writings did show, they've been translated so you can read them, and they do show an unseemly arrogance and a condescension toward those who disagreed with him. And it must be remembered, Galileo was also wrong on the science. The sun is not the center of the universe. It is the center of one solar system in an unimaginably vast universe. So if all sides had just listened to the wise advice of St. Robert Bellarmine in 1616, who was deceased by the time the second trial occurred, all would have been well. Heliocentrism could have been taught for what it was, a theory that might or might not eventually prove to be true. Also damaging to the Church, and ultimately to all of Europe, both ecclesially and politically, was a controversy that began during the reign of Urban VIII and continued on and on and on. And that is the heresy of Jansenism. Jansenism. Jansenism, as a movement, went through many forms during the 150 years between its initial formation and its final destruction during the French Revolution. Jansenism is named for a Dutch-born theologian named Cornelius Jansen, or Jansen, I suppose they would say. That's their version of Johnson, who lived from 1585 to 1638. He studied theology at Louvain, the University of Louvain, which is today in Belgium. Then it was the Netherlands. And there he was exposed to the defective anthropology of Michael Bias, condemned by Pope Pius V in 1567 for his erroneous views on grace, which vacillated between Pelagianism and Calvinism, which is odd because those are exact opposite ends of the spectrum. Calvinism, believes that we were ruined by original sin, and we're predestined. God just decides, because our nothing we can do can merit anything, because we're ruined by original sin. So God just predestines some for salvation and others for damnation, and we don't know why, and there's nothing we can do to change it. So so that's one end. Whereas Pelagianism, on the opposite end of the spectrum, has such a positive view of humanity, it denies the reality of original sin, that it affects anyone. He said, or Pelagius didn't deny original sin, but said its effect is only by means of a bad example, that human nature is not ruined, that we can be sinless on our own, that we can save ourselves without the need of God's grace. So opposite ends of the spectrum. Cornelius Jansen, then studied at the Sorbonne in Paris, where one of his professors was a guy we've previously met, the radical Gallican Edmund Richer. who was was condemned as a heretic for other reasons, but Richer ended up recanting. But Jansen studied under him before that. In those classes, Jansen formed a lifelong friendship with a classmate named Jean Duvergier du Haran, who was better known by his ecclesiastical title, the Abbot of Saint-Cyran, Cyran, who lived from 1581 to 1643. Jansen was the theological father of the heresy in the sense that it's based on his writing. Saint-Cyran was the spiritual and moral promoter of the heresy. In school, they discerned one of the commonalities that made their friendship was they shared an aversion to scholasticism. They felt the entire premise of scholasticism was blasphemous and impossible, namely that expressing the faith in terms of human reason. They felt that scholasticism did nothing but obstruct the purity of Christian antiquity. So they devoted themselves to the study of Scripture and patristics. Jansen believed that he read in St. Augustine the solution to the problem of grace. The relationship between the two extremes. How to resolve, the rift between the Calvinism on one extreme and Pelagianism on the other extreme. And Saint Cyran believed that in Jansen's vision of an extremely disciplined, moral, and spiritual life, that he found the solution to the corruption, the Jesuit, or what he regarded as the Jesuit corruption of society, through corrupting the elite of society by offering lax ethics, lax excuses to be lax toward the ethical life, which he believed the Jesuits promoted in their schools. And because their schools were typically that they recruited the children of the elite, the aristocracy, that's how it had seeped into society. Now, Saint Cyran was a fundamentally prideful and disobedient man, but the tragedy of the episode is that Jansen was actually a loyal and devout Catholic. He genuinely believed that he was doing good. His doctoral dissertation, ironically, defended papal infallibility. And before he died, he included a codicil in his will that if the Holy See ever judged any of his writings to be erroneous, that he wished them to be burned. But that was at the end of his life. So Jansen spent 2 decades composing a commentary on the writings of St. Augustine. But he died during a plague in 1638 before it was ever published. And another irony, he worked his way up. The study of Augustine was like a side project for him. He entered church service, and he was Bishop of Ypres in Belgium. That's spelled Ypres. And there was an outbreak of plague, and he refused to abandon his post. So he was given last rites to those with the plague. Then he contracted the plague, and he died of it. The executor of his will was his lifelong friend, Saint Cyran. Saint Cyran had the commentary published under the title Augustinus in 1640, 2 years after Jansen died. The Augustinus was 1,300 pages long, printed in double columns. First, it consisted of an 8-chapter exposition on Pelagianism. Second, after an introductory study on the limitations of human reason, then moved into analyzing the Pelagianism, the state of innocence or the state of original grace of Adam and the angels, Adam and Eve, the angels and Adam and Eve. Then it moved into a 4-book study of fallen human nature. And then another 3 books to the state of pure nature Is such a thing? Does such a thing still exist after the fall? And then a third volume, a whole nother volume, in the way it was originally published, divided into 10 books on the grace of Christ as Savior. And it concludes with a parallel between semi-Pelagianism and Molinism, which we covered previously. Because Jansenism took on so many forms in the next century and a half, it'll be useful to summarize at the outset, with the caveat that not every Jansenist in the next 150 years believed every single one of these things. And if those things they would say they believed, they didn't necessarily interpret them the same way. So this is a general summary. This isn't a course on Jansenism, so that we have to summarize. So with that caveat, here's a summary. First, doctrinal Jansenism was a crypto-Calvinist interpretation of St. Augustine, asserting that Christ did not die for everyone. He only died for the predestined, those who were predestined for salvation. Those who were not predestined to salvation, Jansen believed were incapable of obeying the commandments because God's grace was not available to them. God had already decided that, okay, these are not predestined for salvation. So they're a lower order of life. So morally, it doesn't matter what they do because they're already damned. This was Jansen's contribution to the heresy that bore his name. Now, he personally was not ever condemned as a heretic because he died before this was published. Yet, this teaching that I just summarized was later condemned. So he's one of those, like Origen. He's a formal heretic, but not a material heretic. Formal heretic in the sense that there's some content in his writings that was later judged as heretical, but not a material heretic because he did not give his assent to those teachings after knowing that they were after judged heretical. And there's that codicil in his will that stands in his favor that said, if it was ever judged, then he repudiates it. Second, moral Jansenism. Now, even though what I'm about to summarize is associated with Jansenism, it's more attributable to Saint-Cyran, who promoted doctrinal Jansenism and then added this element onto it. So with that said, moral Jansenism is extreme asceticism based on a revival of dualism. The old Gnostic belief that the material, the flesh, is intrinsically evil and therefore must be severely disciplined through starvation, love of fast, sleep deprivation, whipping, all that kind of extreme mortification. Now, it crossed from the realm of just extreme into heretical in asserting that only contrition for sins was sufficient for salvation, that attrition was not, and that contrition was only possible for those predestined to receive God's grace. The rest were doomed. So as I said, that was Saint-Cyran's contribution to the movement, especially through the foundation, their foundation at Port Royal, of which he was the spiritual director, and which included, it was a convent, and included the daughters of some of the most powerful and wealthy families in France. So through those families, the movement was able to collect many allies and much support for the cause. Third, Gallican ecclesiology, meaning the National Church ecclesiology, and democratic ideology. So both Jansen and Saint-Cyran were students, took some classes under Edmond Richer at the Sorbonne, whom we covered previously, asserted a form of Gallicanism of the National Church ecclesiology that was so extreme that even other Gallican prelates and the royalty of France made sure the church condemned him. He argued for not only national churches, but national churches governed by a bicameral assembly, a two-house assembly of an upper and lower house. divided by class, which would elect its officers. Now, Richard's ideas were condemned, and he backed down because he didn't want to lose his position or get burned at the stake. But his ideas endured, especially among the class of educated people who, according to the secular hierarchy of the day, were considered commoners, meaning they did not have a title. But they were educated, in some cases much more educated than those who did have titles. So the lawyers, doctors, scholars, journalists, even some royal bureaucrats. Yet they were denied any meaningful role in governing society. All they could do is work for someone with a title. But they couldn't, like they could never actually have the title. They could never act, like all the senior positions of government, even the senior officer corps in the Army and the Navy, you had to have a title to be a senior officer. And we saw in Richerism a conceptual model for change based on natural democracy. So Richerism gave hope to that class of society, educated commoners, of change, in which would allow them what they believed was the role that they should have in society by virtue of their education, and they owned property, so they had a stake in society. And of course, they paid taxes to fund the society. The Jansenists found in this group effective allies, as they control the courts and the newspapers and much of the economy, at least the commercial economy. And they always cast Jansenists as unjustly persecuted by the Jesuit-controlled papacy and royalty. From the perspective of philosophy and theology, the Richerist manifestation of Gallicanism introduced the idea of popular sovereignty into political and theological discourse. And after this, it never went away. Now, of course, these ideas had been present in ancient Greece, but popular sovereignty, in the case of ancient Greece, of Athens and the other city-states, was not what we think of as popular sovereignty. It was confined to property ownership. Like a citizen was one who had the right to own property within the city, and therefore had the stake in society. So, it was property owning adult males. When it was revived, when the idea of popular sovereignty was revived by Richerism, popular sovereignty became an easily understood slogan which could be placed in opposition to the prevailing political ideology of sovereignty based on hereditary legitimacy, either for titled aristocrats and for the king, for the hereditary monarch. Since hereditary legitimacy permanently relegated most of the population to the ranks of servants, even if they were wealthy and educated, they were still in service to some aristocrat or directly to the king. The slogan of popular sovereignty became increasingly powerful. It was the class of these educated commoners, both among the clergy and the laity, who were excluded from any influence over the government. And in the church, clergy who were of common birth did not become bishops. So that class allied with each other, the clergy and laity of that class allied with each other later in 1789 to initiate the first stage of the French Revolution, to end the privileges of hereditary aristocracy in both the government and the church. Now, that first group, the 89 group, did not intend for the revolution to take the homicidal and atheistic turn that it did 3 years later. But it's like Thomas More said, you can't push a guy off a cliff and tell him to stop halfway down. Fourth, disobedience and duplicity. Like all heretics, the Jansenists were disobedient to papal authority when told to remain silent on the contended issues of grace and sacramental confession. When pressed, they adopted the dodge that they did not actually believe the ideas which they were accused of believing. And we'll see how that unfolds. It went out through multiple papacies. Fifth, anti-Jansenism. Anti-Jesuitism. The Jansenists, as well as the Gallicans and the Richerists and the emerging democratic ideologues, all despised the Jesuits. They believed the Jesuits were spies for the Pope, the foreign Italian Pope, and whereas they were loyal to France. It's the Jesuits who were disloyal to France. As you might have French Jesuits who were more loyal to the foreign Italian Pope than they were to France, whereas they, the French Jansenists, were, of course, super patriots. Further, they accused the Jesuits of preaching a diluted moral theology in order to attract followers. Dilute moral theology because then it's easier, and that would attract more followers. And with those followers, they believed the Jesuits used to promote the interest of their order. These groups conspired with like-minded groups in other countries to pressure a later Pope, Clement XIV, to suppress the Jesuit order in 1773. But then those groups themselves were ultimately destroyed 20 years later in the devastation of the radical phase of the French Revolution and the quarter century of warfare which it precipitated. So with all that background, Pope Urban VIII took the first official church action against Jansenism when he condemned the Augustinus, Jansen's commentary on St. Augustine. He condemned the Augustinus on March 6, 1642. Now, this did not end it, but that's all that happened during the reign of Urban VIII. In terms of sanctification, Pope Urban VIII lived in the Baroque age, but he had the soul of a Renaissance man in his patronage of the sacred arts and architecture. And he saw that as part of his sanctification of the church by using beauty to elevate the mind and soul to contemplation of the sacred. Urban's decisive contribution to the history of sacred art was made through his patronage of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, Bernini, who lived from 1598 to 1680. Just as Michelangelo was the ultimate master of the Catholic Renaissance art, Bernini was the ultimate master of Catholic Baroque art. Okay, so to define the terms. The word Baroque, conventionally spelled Baroque, derives from a Portuguese noun, barroco, which is the name of a particular type of pearl that is not a perfect sphere. It has a swirl to it, a pearl that has a swirl to it, not a perfect sphere. And so it has an unpredictable swirling shape. That's a barocco. Hence, in informal usage, the word Baroque can simply mean something elaborate, something with many details, without reference to the Baroque styles, particular styles of the 17th and early 18th centuries. Yet, it does also have a specific meaning. So when capitalized, Baroque does refer to a particular style and period of sacred art in the 17th, and certainly the 17th was but then say into the early 18th, but then you get into the Rococo. So that really the 17th century is the high point of Baroque. Okay, Gian Lorenzo Bernini was born in Naples, southern Italy, on December 7th, 1598. Bernini relocated to Rome, his family did, when Bernini was still a child. His father moved there looking for work. Bernini was a precocious child, and his ability to correctly render the human form in drawing was early noted, which facilitated his coming to the attention of a great patron of the arts, Cardinal Scipione Borghese, who lived from 1576 to 1633. Cardinal Borghese gave Bernini his first serious work, meaning, paid him to do work. And that work was sculpting a series of statues in the Hellenistic Greek style for the Cardinal's palace. At the age of 15, Bernini sculpted David, and his David, it set the tone. I mean, it's astonishing that a 15-year-old could do this. He did not picture David. Often David was pictured after the combat, with Goliath's head at his feet. whereas Bernini portrayed him in the moment of action. So he's twisted, his torso's twisted, and he's holding the sling, in both hands. So he's about to, cast it at Goliath. So sculpted him in motion. At the age of 25, Bernini sculpted the famous Apollo and Daphne, which is still in all serious art history books. It's based on a pagan myth, so it's not sacred in that sense. But technically, it's an accomplishment. It refers to the myth about the god Apollo going after the nymph Daphne, and she doesn't want to give in to his amorous attentions. So the other gods save her by turning her into a tree. And Bernini sculpts it during the transformation, so you can still see there's a woman, but parts of her are already transforming into the tree. And he did this in marble. It's astonishing. And by comparing Bernini's David to Michelangelo's David, we can see the difference in style between the Renaissance and Baroque. Michelangelo, in the Renaissance style, sculpted David at the moment of his decision to fight, but he's just standing at repose. His hands up here, he's holding the stone he's going to use, but you see in his face, it's his decision. Yes, I'm going to fight. Whereas Bernini sculpted David in the moment of action, of actually fighting. And the difference is in the movement. Baroque art sought above all to depict movement and to depict heightened emotions. These works brought Bernini to the attention of other wealthy patrons, and then from them, Bernini's reputation continued to grow, and the Baroque style along with him. In 1624, one of the towers of St. Peter's Basilica, which was still in the process of construction, you remember way back in the reign of Pope Julius II, earlier in this playlist, tore down Constantine's St. Peter's to rebuild a new one. Well, the construction was still going on. In 1624, one of the towers of the new basilica collapsed due to a flaw in its foundation, and Pope Urban VIII was Pope. This is why I'm talking about this now. Pope Urban VIII, who was well connected to the artistic world, already knew of Bernini, had already seen some of his work, and in a moment that changed history, Urban appointed this 26-year-old Bernini as the 7th architect of St. Peter's and as the superintendent of public works in Rome. Bernini proved to be a man of, hyperbole aside, of superhuman energy. For the next half-century, Bernini's tireless energy and imagination gave to Baroque Rome a visual coherence which can still be seen. He brought to his work a deep, deep personal piety. He went to Mass every day, and he practiced the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. So his other, the second appointment he received from Urban in charge of public works, that's infrastructure in the city. So in this, he expanded the number of fountains, public fountains in Rome, to bring clean drinking water to the city. In order to accomplish this, he had to repair some of the ancient Roman aqueducts as well as build new ones. So these fountains had a very practical function, bringing drinking water in. But since he was an artist at heart, each fountain had to be more than a work of hydraulic engineering. It had to be beautiful. The most famous is the huge fountain, which still flows in the Piazza Navona in Rome. He also built the Ponte San Angelo, which crosses the bridge of St. Angelo, the bridge of the Holy Angels, which crosses the Tiber River opposite the Castle San Angelo. It's the castle of the angel, referring to the Archangel Michael. As with the fountains, his bridges could not simply be practical engineering. They were that, but they had to be more than engineering. They had to be beautiful. So he stationed angels along the whole length of the bridge. Each one, that had to be carved. Each one is a work of art. From the perspective of church history, Bernini accomplished what no one in over a century had been able to do. He completed the new Basilica of St. Peter's. He cast the monumental bronze baldacchino above the high altar, That's the four bronze pillars holding up. Well, I mean, it's supposed to be a canopy, but it's bronze over the high altar, which is under the dome. He cast the equally impressive throne of St. Peter's against the back wall or front. I mean, opposite the entrance. I'll put it that way. So if you think of the entrance to St. Peter as the front, then the opposite end, the apse, is the back. But you pointed to it, so it's in that wall, the opposite end from the opening, up against the wall. Above the throne of St. Peter's on the back wall, is a window of the Holy Spirit. It looks like stained glass, but it's not. It's alabaster. For the exterior, Bernini accomplished what everyone told him was impossible. He enclosed an area the size of the Colosseum with a colonnade of 4 parallel rows on each side, large enough for 2 carriages to drive past each other, in opposite directions, inside of the 2 central rows of columns, so they could go both ways and still be under cover. Now, Bernini, he did many other, and he continued working long after Urban's death. But the Pope's confidence in this young man was rewarded when he, Pope Urban, was able to consecrate St. Peter's Basilica on November 18th, 1626. 120 years after Pope Julius II laid the cornerstone on April 18th, 1506. St. Peter's covers 5.7 acres. It can fit 60,000 people within its walls. The dome is 448 feet high, 136 feet in diameter. Now, that's just the church. The piazza outside of St. Peter can encompass over 100,000 people. Okay, developments during the reign of Urban. The 30 Years' War continued to bleed Europe throughout Urban's pontificate. To follow all the details of the pointless slaughter would, be depressing, as well as, taking us too far afield from our topic. From the perspective of church history, there's one important item to note that occurred during Urban's reign. In 1635, France entered the war, the 30 Years' War, but on the Protestant side. Even though France was officially a Catholic country, it allied with the Protestants against the Catholics because of their traditional enmity towards the Habsburg dynasty, which ruled Austria and Germany and Spain. This is why, when we began the 30 Years' War, I said it was the last of the wars of religion. And this is why. This action by France was consistent with their enduring foreign policy aims, which was against the Habsburgs, and had been seen, in the Habsburg-Valois Wars of the 16th century, which we covered in, earlier, and that they would become in the Habsburg-Bourbon Wars of the 17th century. And it's such a tragedy for the church because France's involvement, along with others, we're going to get Sweden and we're going to get others involved, just perpetuated the war and led to the material ruin of Central Europe, the decimation of the population, mostly innocent, caught in the middle, the deepening of the irrational hatreds based on nationality, ethnicity, and religion. But anyway, that's what happened. So the 30 Years' War, this a Catholic power allying with the Protestants against other Catholic powers means it even though it might have started for religious reasons, it really ceased being a war of religion and was just a power struggle. So that's why the 30 Years' War is considered the last of the wars of religion. Pope Urban VIII died on July 29th, 1644, followed by the reign of Pope Innocent X, to whom we will turn in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.